So here's the question sitting at the top of this episode. What happens when thousands of ordinary people acting independently start seeing the same inconsistencies the official narrative did not account for? It's not about hysteria, right? It's not about conspiratorial fantasizing, but it is about pattern recognition at scale. And the reason it matters here around the killing of Charlie Kirk is that the official record is public, it's structured, it's time stamped, and mostly coherent. Yet the investigative community has been circling the same blind spots for months. And whenever that many unrelated thinkers, including people on Reddit, Twitter, YouTube analysts, security experts, and even faith based commentators spot overlapping gaps, it becomes harder to pretend that those gaps don't exist. I am not jumping to Candace Owens' conclusion, but I am understanding why her suspicions don't fall into a vacuum. They land on soil already tilled by thousands of people who are comparing the rooftop footage, cross checking FBI timelines, following the autopsy sequence, and noticing where early reporting shifted as more evidence came in. This collective attention creates pressure, not because a community replaces forensic fact, but because it refuses to let institutionally convenient answers settle prematurely. And for Christians, this instinct is discernment. Scripture calls for testing all things, holding fast what is good, and refusing to give darkness the courtesy of silence. We are not rejecting evidence, but we are refusing to ignore contradictions that actual evidence raises. That posture of being firm, thoughtful, and unshaken anchors us in truth rather than fear. And that's the atmosphere we need before diving into what the community actually uncovered. When you actually step into that investigative ecosystem, whether you're scrolling through Reddit mega threads, Twitter investigative timelines, OSIN style YouTube breakdowns, you immediately see why the phrase community findings is not an exaggeration. One of the strongest examples is how Reddit users compiled parallel timelines from publicly released FBI documents and local news footage, highlighting inconsistencies in the first hour of reporting. Not fabrications, just discrepancies that became clearer as more data dropped. You had people screenshotting frame by frame rooftop shadows to confirm angles. Another group comparing UVU's roof access protocols from facility manuals they dug up, and entire threads dedicated to mapping emergency audio timestamps with eyewitness cell phone uploads. This is the exact kind of open source intelligence work journalists now depend on. Meanwhile, on Twitter, you had independent analysts assembling chronological threads that tracked when certain claims were made, corrected, or contradicted by official releases. These were not wild accusations. They were cold attempts to reconcile conflicting time data, like when initial autopsy commentary leaked before the final toxicology timeline was officially published. And then you saw long form YouTube breakdowns from creators who specialize in public record analysis, pointing out procedural oddities where the chain of custody and early reporting looked rushed, where law enforcement phrased things in extremely careful, almost hedged language, and where significant gaps were simply labeled under investigation long after basic forensic checks should have been done. The point I am making here is that the crowd was not imagining smoke. They were identifying places where the room still smelled like fire. And that body of work created the environment in which Candace Owens' louder, more forceful feeling suspicions found traction, not because she proved the plot, but because the crowd already saw pressure points worth questioning. Now, this is where the conversation becomes more concrete because you start noticing the same leads resurfacing everywhere as independent researchers combed through public material. One example is the timeline compression between the first rooftop identification and the confirmation of the shooter's position. Several analysts, again using only publicly available footage, argue that the timing between the crowd reaction, the emergency calls, and the official confirmation did not line up cleanly. Not because they are accusing the feds of hiding something, but because early updates often rely on chaotic data. The social media investigators didn't drop it. They kept overlaying audio spectrograms and matching them with police dispatch logs, pointing out where the gaps were. Another widely circulated line of inquiry is roof access. Community sleuths located the building's facility diagrams, matched them with older UVU security audits, and noted that the specific access route mentioned in initial reports was not the most direct or discreet one. Then you had commentary from legitimate YouTube analysts, people who openly said they were not even endorsing Candace Owens' theory, yet still emphasized odd asymmetries in how fast the shooter was identified relative to how slow some other statements were updated. Meanwhile, on Facebook, faith based creators approached the situation from a moral angle. If something looks off, Christians shouldn't numb themselves with the assumption that the system has it handled. They argue that throughout biblical history, those in power used misdirection to maintain control, and God repeatedly called his people to see through deceit with clarity, not fear. None of these voices claimed a grand psyop. They simply pointed out that uncomfortable questions refused to resolve themselves. And when independent minds converge on the same stress points, pressure builds, not on individuals, but on institutions to clarify the record. And this convergence is exactly why the broader suspicion around the event didn't evaporate even after the official statements dropped. Candace Owens did not create the pressure, the crowd did. She amplified it. That's all. The community driven leads had already laid the groundwork because of timeline conflicts, procedural loose ends, and an ongoing sense that certain explanations felt prematurely packaged. Even mainstream analysts acknowledged that the speed of some federal updates contrasted sharply with the slowness of others. You had investigative journalists noting that public statements often come in oddly layered sequences. Details that should have been confirmed later appeared early, and details that should have been immediate took days. And the community caught all of that. This is the moment where the psychological dynamic shifts, when thousands of individuals working independently keep arriving at the same confusion points. The narrative no longer belongs to the institution. It now becomes shared property. And once that happens, pressure increases, not because people want chaos. No, people want coherence. This instinct maps onto something theological. Truth is meant to be brought into the light. Deception, confusion, conveniently incomplete narratives, those are tools of darkness. The investigations we are watching are not just political reactions, they are expressions of a deeper human impulse wired by God Himself. The refusal to let evil hide behind complexity. That's the spiritual framing of it all. That's why so many believers watching this are not spiraling into paranoia, but they are stepping into discernment. They are not saying, the feds lied. They're saying, the loose threads we keep seeing deserve answers. And that posture, which is analytical and grounded, sets the stage for the next half of this episode where we explore how these community findings sharpen Candace's broader suspicions and they create pressure points that can't simply be waved away. Okay, so let's examine how these community driven threads intersect with Candace Owens' perspective. She consistently argued that Charlie's assassination wasn't just a tragic act of lone violence, but a symptom of institutional failures and potentially orchestrated manipulation. When you overlay that with the timelines, the CCTV analyses, and access route observations, you start to see why her claims resonated. The investigative crowd had already highlighted the points she emphasized: the timing discrepancies, the odd security gaps, the procedural anomalies. Candace's narrative did not exist as a standalone pie in the sky idea. It was amplified because the collective work of thousands of independent researchers had already uncovered fertile ground for skepticism. Now, this is important. None of the publicly verifiable materials prove a coordinated deep state or foreign psyop, but the patterns themselves, which are publicly accessible yet complex, contradictory, and partially unexplained, create cognitive friction. And cognitive friction is what causes public attention to shift, what makes ordinary citizens begin asking, why are these pieces not aligning? And this is where discernment matters. Romans 8 reminds us that nothing can separate believers from God's love. But discernment is what allows us to navigate complexity without succumbing to fear or cynicism. Candace's voice, amplified by a crowd already dissecting gaps, becomes a lightning rod, not because she invented evidence, but because she channeled collective unease into a coherent narrative that people could wrestle with. It balanced critically against documented facts. Then we should consider why the convergence of these findings matter beyond the immediate case. Community-led research often functions as a stress test for institutional narratives. When thousands of minds independently reach the same questions, institutions face pressure to clarify, adjust, or expand disclosure. In the Charlie case, independent timelines exposed where the public record was slow or ambiguous, creating a space for Candace to amplify concern. You saw a similar pattern on YouTube videos, breaking down previous high-profile events. Creators tracing publicly available documents to reveal timing gaps, to reveal procedural oddities and unanswered questions. These examples show that transparency is not just a nicety, it is a test of institutional accountability. God doesn't need human institutions to confirm his truth. But he does empower communities to act with integrity, to expose injustice, and maintain moral clarity. Community driven investigations, then, are a modern extension of biblical wisdom, examining what is observable, holding leaders accountable, and exercising one's God given discernment. That's why the ongoing online scrutiny matters. It isn't just gossip, it's a demonstration of collective responsibility and moral clarity. Even as Candace leans into whatever suspicions she has, the community's contribution is foundational. The dual effect is that public institutions feel pressure and ordinary citizens are reminded of their own agency, both practical and spiritual, in demanding clarity, truth, and accountability. This is why I'm hoping that Candace doesn't just react to the TPUSA live stream next week. I'm hoping that they actually really patch her in to the live stream if they really want to be able to put a lot of speculation to rest. Because icing her out will just make things worse for them. And I don't think that will end well for the organization. But also, we must acknowledge the limitations. While community patterns highlight anomalies, correlation does not equal causation. Not always, at least. Thousands of researchers noticing timing gaps or roof access oddities doesn't automatically prove a larger conspiracy. And Candace herself, despite her compelling articulation, is working sometimes in the realm of speculation when she talks about orchestrated psyops or global manipulation. All right? This is why careful listeners must differentiate between observation, interpretation, and definitive proof. The evidence based observations, including the timestamps, the public filings, the FOIA responses, remain the bedrock. And perhaps once the autopsy has also been released, that would be useful too. But the interpretive layer, where the speculation about motives, coordination, and malevolent intent is where faith and discernment intersect. Christians do not reject critical inquiry. They filter it through God's lens, understanding that human evil exists but never supersedes divine authority. This is where Romans 8 is not just comforting, but it is instructive. The community's investigative pressure exposes gaps and forces accountability, but believers maintain perspective. No earthly power can ultimately separate them from God's sovereignty. Observing and questioning are vital, but so is rooting judgment and hope in God rather than in fear of human manipulation. Finally, what does this teach us about influence, responsibility, and authority in a digital age? Charlie's case demonstrates that dispersed independent minds can create pressure points that institutional actors cannot ignore, at least not for too long. Candace's commentary acts as a narrative amplifier, but the underlying force is the community itself. And for Christians, there is a parallel in spiritual authority. God has placed power, wisdom, and responsibility in human hands, but only discernment allows it to operate rightly. The investigative crowd, whether motivated by curiosity or skepticism or their civic responsibility, mirrors what God calls believers to do: to watch, examine, test, and hold fast to truth. As the public digests the findings, debates will continue to unfold and patterns will be scrutinized. The lesson here is twofold. One, collective human inquiry can uncover inconsistencies that demand attention. And two, ultimate meaning and authority are anchored not in institutional narratives or conspiracy theories, but in God's eternal kingdom. Even as Candace's claims stir controversy, the theological anchor remains. Manipulation, violence, and fear are tools of a broken system. But believers have authority, clarity, and hope that can never be extinguished. Community findings create pressure because independent minds refuse to ignore contradictions. And believers navigate that pressure with discernment, grounded in scripture and prayer, confident that no temporal power can truly sever them from God's love. The crowd scrutiny is temporary, God's sovereignty is eternal. And that is the lens through which we view every anomaly, every unanswered question, every suspicious timeline. Always remembering that while humans pursue answers, ultimate truth belongs to Him. And the truth will always come to light.